Right then, this video is all about development. It's the beginning of the Development in an African Context module, but this is before the Africa part, so that you've got some vague idea of what development is and how we measure it. Yeah, ideally watch it before the Africa stuff. Okay. You may have heard of a phrase that's quite popular on social media. There's lots of memes and stuff about first world problems. And I've included an image there, which to me is kind of a pretty ultimate first world problem, that after your Mercedes has been serviced, you might actually have to move your seat back to your position. And there is a hyperlink there, but if you Google first world problems, there are loads of kind of things about it. Now, I mention this firstly because hopefully this module will teach you that the things that we often kind of moan about in the rich developed world, globally speaking, they're kind of not problems. And secondly, because of the use of the phrase first world. So I'm going to tell you all of the things that you're not allowed to say, and then I'll tell you what you are allowed to say. Okay, so when we're talking about development, the first categorization that was used was first world, which were rich countries, second world, which were essentially communist countries that they didn't really know where to put them, and third world, which were the poor countries. You will occasionally hear this on the news, and my parents certainly would still use this classification. We do not use this. Okay, so it's very outdated. So, okay, yes, first world problems are a thing on social media, but we wouldn't be talking about these terms in a geography essay. Then, in the 1980s, there was the Brandt line, B-R-A-N-D-T, the Brandt line, which pretty much divided the rich north and the poor south. Notice, please, that Australia and New Zealand have always been anomalies. And this, as you can see, was very much preoccupied with who's got the money, who hasn't got the money, and that sort of thing. We don't talk about rich and poor anymore. This was kind of what I learned when I did my geography education. We talked about least developed MEDCs, more economically developed countries, LEDCs, less economically developed countries. You might have learned about NICs, lots of groups of countries. Now, it's not the end of the world if you use that terminology. You're not going to fail by any stretch of the imagination. But essentially, folks, what we are now trying to do is to not put countries into groups, because the assumption about a group is that all of the members are very similar. And actually, that's just not true with MEDCs, LEDCs, etc., etc. It kind of makes a bit of a nonsense of the whole thing. So what we are trying to do now is we're trying to think of something called the Development Continuum. The idea is that we are going to treat every country individually wherever possible. We're not going to put countries into groups. And the way that we do this is with something called the Human Development Index, which we'll be picking up again on later. Notice that according to the Human Development Index, which is regarded to be kind of the best measurement of development that we currently have in the world, according to that, Norway would be right at the top of the pile. It would be the most developed country in the world. And if I scroll through, you can see that we're going down the rankings. Right, I'm going to go quite quickly now. And then you get to the bottom, and currently the least developed country in the world is Niger, which is very relevant. Notice also African countries seem to occupy the bottom bit, which you'll learn is no coincidence. So what you would do, and obviously we don't expect you to remember the rankings at all, but Norway would be right at the top, the most developed country in the world. Niger would be down here, the least developed country in the world, and they would all be ranked. Therefore, when you're talking about countries, you can talk about developed, developing, and if you're comparing them to each other, you can talk about more developed than, less developed than. We're trying to, be more individualistic, basically, okay? Not the end of the world if you do MEDCs or more developed, less developed. That's, some variation on that. But try to avoid putting countries into groups if you can. All right, that's where we're at with terminology. So what is development? What does that actually mean? I would really like you to learn that definition, or at least, a version of it. It doesn't have to be word perfect. The progressive improvement of the standard of living and quality of life. And what I'd really like to emphasise is there's no mention of money. It's not about rich and poor. It's not about all of that. It's very focused now on people, how they're living, whether they've got, access to things. That is very much the thrust. We have moved on considerably. Okay. How do countries develop? Well, ironically, most countries of the world need some money in order to develop. So although money is not mentioned here, that progressive improvement probably needs a little bit of money to make it happen. But I suppose what we're trying to emphasise is that's not the bit we're interested in. We're interested in people. But we do acknowledge that to get there, you probably do have to spend a bit of cash. This is my simple version, so this is not, a model that you have to learn. I would very definitely like to create some kind of geographical model that everyone has to learn that's named after me, but I'm not clever enough to have created one yet. So you make some money, which gives you economic growth. The key thing is that your government or whoever's running your country then needs to invest that money into things that are going to make everyone's lives better. So in that circle, I've put healthcare and education, but it could also be sewage networks, it could be telephone lines, it could be creating a police force, it could be so many things. But the trick is to use your money to make the country better, and then you will get the progressive improvement in the standard of living and quality of life for an increasing proportion of the population. All right, so that's just my very simple version to try and explain to it. There are anomalies. Now, again, I'm not expecting you to remember these. I'm just using them to prove a point. There are countries, of which Saudi Arabia is an example, who make money but don't use that money to make life better for most of the population. So they're rich, but they're not very developed, which is why we're trying to sort of unpin that link between the two. Kerala, which is a state of India, a part of India, it's in southwest India, has very little money, but yet they've managed to give people good quality of life. And we're just trying to prove that although for most countries in the world the two go hand in hand, that is not necessarily the case. I don't expect you to know what all of this means. This is how much money they've got. Very different. That's life expectancy, how long people would live. This is their Human Development Index, which we very briefly looked at for the continuum. All I need you to know today is that high numbers are good. Okay, so that's better, and more people can read and write. With very little money, they have managed to make people's quality of life better than Saudi Arabia with all of their oil. Okay, so yes, money is usually involved, but we're trying to break that sort of cause and effect kind of thing. This is just a bit of silliness, really. I always say, if you were in charge of a country and had all that money, but you were the sort of person that didn't want to make other people's lives better, what could you buy? Which led to us having a Google search of the most ridiculous things that you can spend your money on. And it also led to the discovery of this place, which is insane, which I suppose is where super rich people do their shopping. Look, helicopters, jets, boats, cars. Yeah, you get the idea, ladies and gents. So you can flash the cash, Or what we rather you would do is spend your money wisely on things that are going to benefit lots of people. Okay, now this is an optional part. Some people find this really helpful, which is why I still go through it. But can I emphasise that if you decide that you don't like this, or if you're feeling like, I've got plenty to know, thanks very much, Nikki, then you can ignore this bit. The Rostow model describes in much more detail than I've just given you how a country develops, like the series of events that it goes through, from being a very sort of undeveloped country to being a developed country. So I'm going to try my best to talk you through it. Stage 1. So all countries would have started in stage 1. Some of them, like, you know, thousands of years ago, but nonetheless, all countries would have started here. Subsistence means you're just getting enough food for you and your family. It's not for money, it's just to survive, okay? Bartering is before money. So if you had caught an extra fish that you didn't need and somebody else had picked more berries than they needed, you might swap some berries for a fish. Bartering is swapping. There's no money at the moment. And pretty much everybody is involved in agriculture. Everyone is involved in farming. And if you think back to your Changing Places module from year 1, this would very much be when everyone worked in the primary sector. Okay, this is a very traditional society. So here is my little graphic of everyone being involved in agriculture, and a little bit of, oh, it wasn't berries, it was some grain. Look, swapping a fish for some grain there. Okay, what then happens? So what then happens, stage 2, is that people begin to specialise in certain types of farming. One family might be really good at growing potatoes, another family might discover they're brilliant at producing wheat, another family might be really good at rearing cows. Families begin to specialise, and because they get really good at whatever it is they've specialised in, they produce surpluses. They have too much of what they have, and therefore you begin to see markets. You begin to see people going to market to sell their surpluses. This is when money appears, and infrastructure, because if you're going to market, you need roads, you might need bed and breakfast or taverns. You begin to see market towns. So Taunton is originally a market town. The reason it came into existence is for farmers to meet here near a bridging point of the River Tone to come to market. So there's definitely true, and this is where a few African countries are at. They've brought their wares to market to sell. They've got too much for their own families, and so they are buying and selling goods at market. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. That's stage 2. Stage 3 is your industrial phase. So for the UK, this would have been the Industrial Revolution. China is in stage 3 right now. You begin to see people coming out of the primary sector because of things like mechanisation, and they begin to work in factories. So you're going to start to see rural to urban migration. You're going to start to see your towns and cities getting bigger. You're going to start to see factories. You're going to start to see all sorts of changes. It's probably the time of the most rapid change. So I just thought I'd give you a picture of some factories there for that one. Stage 4, you are becoming a more developed country by this point. Places kind of like South Korea would be here. Diversification means that you're beginning to do different things. So instead maybe of just making all of the cheap plastic goods, you are actually making slightly cleverer things like cars, or you might be making phones or whatever. So you start making new stuff. You innovate, you actually start to create your own products. South Korea, Samsung, for example, is a South Korean company that kind of created itself. Hyundai is another one. So they actually begin to create their own factories. They start to do more for themselves, and there's more money. So as you can see, you go into kind of much more high-tech kind of things. Stage 5 is where the UK and many other more developed countries are. We don't make stuff, we buy stuff. We are consumers. We might make a few bits and bobs, but most of us work in the service sector, which we've talked about again in Changing Places. Okay, so like I said, that is optional, but it might just help you understand very, very basically how a country goes from being not very developed at all to being well developed. Okay, this is an important bit for everybody. How do we measure development? Well, there are, I was going to say hundreds. There might even be thousands of ways of measuring development. There are loads and loads and loads. Do you need to remember them all? Absolutely not. But I thought I would share with you this kind of slightly bonkers website called World Mapper. And I've just taken a few screen grabs to show you. So in geography, one of the techniques we use to present data is proportional symbols. We draw symbols, usually squares or bars or maybe circles, at different sizes to represent the amount of something. Well, this website, World Mapper, draws countries at different sizes. This is the world map as you would expect to see it. Here is the world map representing births in 2017. So you can see Australia's kind of puckered up, hardly there. India's gone a bit bonkers. And anyway, we carry on. That's the number of women that die in pregnancy and childbirth. That's pretty bleak, isn't it? Meat consumption, look, is sort of almost the antithesis, look. Child labour, girls not at secondary school, deaths from starvation, internet users, mad. Look, Africa, the whole continent of Africa pretty much disappears for aircraft passengers. So you don't need to remember all the ways that we measure development, but there are just loads and loads and loads of things that you can look at, loads of data. I would just like to take the opportunity at this point to remind you about this resource, which we used in year 1 for inequality, and I just think it's really interesting. So Dollar Street is a way of trying to think about development in a qualitative way. So instead of numbers, which can get a bit overwhelming, photos. What is life actually like? So you can watch the little video of the people that created it, but you can also, hang on, I've got to find the link to Dollar Street, there we are, and you can play around with it. So you can do families, but look, you can do loads of topics. You can focus on particular countries. You don't have to do all of them. You can you can only look at like the poorest if you wanted. You don't have, let's do that. You don't have to look at everybody. Anyway, you can play around with it a lot. But what I love about Dollar Street is I think it's much more meaningful than just looking at a number. I find a little video. So look, anything with a little play button, you can have a little video. It really gives you a much better feel of how people live around the world. And that it's important to remember that we can measure development in a quantitative way, in lots of numbers, but we can also look at development in a qualitative way as well. So the qualities of something. So that's worth checking out if you'd forgotten about it. And there's just a little reminder if you find that a bit confusing. Okay, the one that I do need to pick up on a little bit, and there is some stuff in your module booklet about this, are the money measurements, the GNP, GDP, all of that kind of stuff. Per capita, if you ever see anything that's per capita, it just means per person. I will teach you in class the difference between GNP and GDP because I have tried to draw the diagram online and it was a disaster. But essentially, gross national is about ownership. So for example, the Dyson factory, which is in another country, would still be included in the British figure. okay, because it's a British company. So GNP is about who owns it. GDP, we have a Toyota factory in Derby, which is Japanese. We wouldn't include that in the GNP because it's not British, but we would include it in the GDP. It's a bit weird, but anyway, they're both measurements of money. They're not perfect, and either of them, and like I say, we are trying to move away from using money to measure development, but it does still feature quite a lot. Do we know about all of the economic activity in a country? No. People, do dodgy accounts, don't they? I know they shouldn't, but they do. Lots of people do cash in hand work, which the economy don't know about. So they're not perfect, but they do get used a lot. And if you've wondered why they are always in American dollars, well, they've all got to be in one currency, because if you were given $100 billion note in Zimbabwe, you probably would have felt like you'd won the lottery. And actually, you're not very rich at all because of an economic crisis that happened. The value of their currency just went bonkers. It all has to be in one currency for you to be able to compare it, otherwise it doesn't make any sense at all. So just be aware of a couple of issues with measuring the wealth of a country, that's all. But see your module booklet for further details. So what's the best way to measure development? Well, the best way is either to look at lots and lots and lots of different indicators to get yourself like a balanced picture, and a composite indicator kind of attempts to do that for you, but in a nice, easy way. So composite means made up of several parts or elements. And I've already shown you a quick sneaky peek of the Human Development Index, which is our favourite composite indicator. So you can see, and before any of you panic, you do not have to be able to work this out for yourself. I'm sure some of you could, but you don't have to. You just have to understand what the result of it means, okay? So they take lots of data into account and they come out with a number between 0 and 1. The only reason I'm using Wikipedia for this is because it does it in one nice long list. I am not generally an advocate. but so it comes out with just a number between 0 and 1. At the moment, as we've established, Norway is at the top of the pile with 0.957, and poor old Niger is at the bottom of the pile with 0.394. Okay, so they do all the maths for you. They've looked at a range of different things, which we've established is a good thing. You wouldn't want to make a decision just on wealth because, sorry to go back, but it's worth doing. There we are. If I just gave you the GDP figure, the wealth of these two places, you would assume that everything in Saudi Arabia was better than Kerala, and that's not true. But equally, if I just gave you the literacy, it's not the full picture, okay? You have to look at a range of data. Sorry if this is making your eyes go funny. So composite indicators kind of attempt to do that for you, and you get, for the HDI, the Human Development Index, which is, widely regarded to be the best measurement of development in the world, you get a result between 0 and 1. High numbers are good, low numbers are not as good. All right, so that's the best one. But any indicator is an average, and we don't like averages. We have to use them because they make our lives a little bit easier, but they are not good. This is a nice easy model that you could chuck into an essay, nice easy drawing. The core periphery model is the idea that within a country you will have a core, which is usually the capital city, which is where everything is better. More money, more jobs, more expensive housing, more museums, better hospitals, better schools, all of that kind of thing. And the further you get away from the core, the worse everything gets. And periphery means edges. You may have heard of people talking about your peripheral vision, which is like the very edge of what you're able to see. Periphery, edge. Now, in the UK, the core is around London, and the further you go in all directions away from London, the worse things get. Not necessarily the views. The views are lovely, but if you go down, if you look at the average wage in Cornwall, the rate of unemployment, the quality of medical care, it all gets worse as you go away from London. Now, if therefore I gave you a development indicator for England, it's an average, isn't it? It doesn't tell you enough detail about the different places in England. If I gave you an average for the whole of the UK, there's going to be variations within that. So we don't like that level of averaging. And just to prove this to you, this is, I've got to remember, this is average wages. Yeah, that's right. Higher in London, decrease as you go down. You can apply it to the world. Doesn't kind of really work, but you can. You can apply the core periphery model to any scale you want, really. As long as you remember that everything's better in the core and worse in the periphery, you're fine. So this is life expectancy. But it's not just place that's going to give you variation. Gender. If you have one statistic for males and females, that might hide loads of variation that you just don't know about. Now you can see in some of those countries, it wouldn't matter because the male and the female is exactly the same. But actually, if you were trying to find out, for example, about Benin or India, you do need the variation because they are quite different. So we're still back to the same point, which is averaging hides variation, but we're now talking about a different kind of variation. We're talking about gender. Looking slightly ahead, one of the countries that we are going to focus on for this module is a country in Africa called Burkina Faso. And if you wanted a sneak peek, women are treated very, very much as second-class citizens in Burkina Faso and do not have access to many of the things that men do. So maybe we do need gender-specific data. But also for ethnic groups. So this is America. This is a developed country, but we have quite considerable differences in death rates for different ethnic groups. So the moral of the story, this is going to start for the next video. The moral of the story, the HDI, the Human Development Index, is the best measurement of development in the world right now, but even that is an average, and we don't like averages very much. Okay.